Good afternoon and welcome. I am so glad that so many of you are joining us today for our fourth in the series of our UT System Early Childhood Scholars Series. The purpose of these events is to bring together the talent from across UT systems, 14 institutions that represent the best across our state, so that we could really explore together what we know about early childhood. We welcome folks who are scholars within our institutions. We welcome community members and state leaders across Texas, and we have folks joining us from around the country. So I'm so pleased today that the University of Texas at Dallas is going to be sharing with us some of the great work that they've been doing on relational health, and especially with regard to children and with autism. And I am excited to introduce my colleague, Dr. Margaret Owen, who is the director of the Center for Children and Families at UT Dallas, and has really been a leader across our state in helping us understand how to improve the lives of children and families. And she's going to introduce some of her colleagues that have been doing some cutting edge work in that space. So again, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope that you continue to join this series with us. And Margaret, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you very much. And I want to extend my welcome as well. As Cynthia said, I'm Margaret Owen. I am a professor of psychology at the University of Texas at Dallas, and I direct our Center for Children and Families in the School of Behavioral and Brain Sciences. And I'm very excited to be the host today of today's webinar of the UT System Early Childhood Scholars Series. The CCF, or the Center for Children and Families, is excited to be featuring two of our faculty affiliates of the center, Drs. Pam Rollins and Andrea Warner-Sis. Both Dr. Rollins and Dr. Warner-Sis are professors in our Department of Speech, Language, and Hearing in the School of Behavioral and Brain Sciences, and they're going to be addressing issues of relational health. And these are issues that stem from Dr. Rollins' research on social development in children with ASD, and from Dr. Warner-Sis's research on the effects of hearing differences among children and adolescents on their communication and social interaction skills. They'll both be sharing implications for intervention and practice with these children and their families. So let me please turn this over to Dr. Rollins, who will begin our two talks. I want to tell you though, please list any questions that you have in the Q&A box that you'll see on your screen. And after the two presentations, we will have time to share those questions and entertain a dialogue. So, Dr. Rollins?
Thank you. I'm going to try to share my screen. Hold on. Okay, so I hope I'm sharing my screen. So thank you, Margaret. I am really grateful to have the opportunity to share with you the work of the Social Communication Lab. The core mission of the Social Communication Lab is to understand social communication in children with autism and to help improve their lives and the lives of their families. For those of you who are not familiar with autism, it's a neurodevelopmental disorder that emerges before the age of 3. A child doesn't have to be diagnosed before 3, but the symptoms have to be evident before the age of 3. All individuals with autism, no matter what age, have two core features: restricted repetitive patterns of behaviors and interests, and persistent impairment in social communication and interaction. Autism is considered a spectrum because of the diversity of comorbidities. This diagram shows the medical, behavioral, cognitive comorbidities, as well as biomarkers and genetics. What I want you to pay attention to are the two dark circles on the top. Intellectual disability, there's a range of intellectual functioning in individuals with autism, as well as language impairment. The takeaway from the bubble on language impairment is that language is a comorbidity. It is not a core feature of autism. That means autism is not a problem with language, but rather how to use language for social interactions. Autism can be reliably diagnosed between 18 and 24 months, but most children aren't diagnosed until later, at least 4 to 5 years of age. It's also most children with autism have an impairment, well, all children with autism have impaired social cognition, and impaired social cognition is an early indicator of autism. Interestingly, the only other group that has social cognitive delays decoupled from other cognitive delays are children with hearing differences, which Dr. Warner-Sis will be talking about later. So, my plan for today is to talk to you a little bit about social cognition and, in particular, the shared emotion stage. I will stress the two aspects of shared emotion stage, mutual gaze and social responsiveness, and how they are important targets for early intervention with children with autism. In so doing, I will be reviewing the Pathways Early Autism Intervention Program that bridges the research to practice gap. So, over the first 2 years of life, typical children go through three major qualitative changes in their cognitive development: sharing emotions, pursuing goals, and joint attention. Of these three stages, oops, of these three stages, only sharing emotion and joint attention constitute social cognition. The emergence of joint attention signals that the child has knowledge that they are sharing objects and events with another person, a skill that is extraordinarily difficult for children with autism to achieve. For this reason, improving joint attention is the focus of many socially based interventions. However, our work in the social communication lab starts earlier and addresses the sharing emotion stage because sharing emotions is the precursor to joint attention. Sharing emotions develops around 2 months of age, and with the onset of social smiling, there's an increase in mutual gazing that launches the dyad into a new quality of shared affect. Many of you who are parents may remember this stage. The face to face interactions are typically well balanced with reciprocal exchanges of vocalizations, facial expressions, and emotions. In the last few years, there has been more and more research suggesting that both mutual gaze and social responsiveness facilitate the activation of the social brain network. So I want to show you this diagram where sociability is on the y-axis, and this is based on an article from Jones and Klin. And what you see here is that there's a decline in eye gaze in children with autism during the sharing emotion stage. They, at any point in the sharing emotion stage, they may look like a typical individual, but over time, there's a decline. So you have to look longitudinally. In contrast, typically developing children experience an increase in eye gaze over time, leading to normative social development. This suggests that children with autism miss out on the opportunities to engage in mutual gaze and social responsiveness. Several of the authors, including Jones and Klins and others, have suggested that intervention focusing on mutual gaze may adjust the pattern of brain activity towards a more typical trajectory. With that in mind, we chose to study Pathways Parent Mediated Early Intervention, which was developed by Michelle Campbell and Renee Hoffman. Pathways is a naturalistic developmental behavioral intervention, which is now considered best practices for young children with autism. And the reason why we chose it is that the early units focus on the shared emotion skills of mutual gaze and social responsiveness. So let's look at an example of a child with autism and her mom.
Look. Look at me. Look over here. Yeah, Sophia. Good job. With the clack clack here and the clack clack there.
What you may have noticed is a child's lack of social awareness makes it hard for a mother to engage with her. By definition, social interaction takes two people. So the goal of parent-mediated intervention is to help parents optimize their interactions to facilitate child development. Many parent mediated interventions for children with autism coach parents on how to optimize interactions around joint attention and language. So, for example, in this interaction, the focus would be on developing joint attention routines to share and talk about the puzzle. In contrast, our work focuses on the precursors to joint attention, where we coach parents to optimize dyadic interactions without objects and focus on mutual gaze and social responsiveness prior to working on joint attention.
Look.
Pathways is a manualized intervention, and all of the materials, the manual, we have an auditory and written version of the manual, are in both English and Spanish. We use a coaching model where we have interventions go to the home or another authentic environment for the family, 90 minutes, one time a week. And we do have bilingual therapists. Pathways also meets the service delivery model for Texas IDEA Part C, Early Child Intervention, which is ECI or birth to 3, right? And for us, this is a very, very important aspect of the intervention because few research-based interventions for autism meet ECI standards. The result is a disconnect between research-supported practices and what's happening in the community. So the coaching model that we use is based on adult learning strategies recommended by the Division of Early Childhood. Coaching supports caregivers in improving their child's functional skills through authentic learning, reflection, problem solving, and moving on to self-efficacy, or the confidence in the ability to exert control over their behavior and the social environment. Now, a problem that's been identified in the early intervention literature is that it's difficult for interventionists to transition from an intervention as expert model to an intervention as coach model. So, our solution is to make coaching easy by integrating the principles of coaching directly into the strategies and the activities of the intervention session. So you'll see the activity sequence on the left for a typical session. While I'm not going to review any of it in detail, you can see that there's time. We have a video observation, and then there's time for the parent to reflect on the video observation and evaluate how they believe they're doing on this specific target skills. There's parent practice and problem solving, and time for the parent to develop an activity plan on how they'll use the intervention strategies during the following week. Over the last 7 years, our lab has been conducting research to better understand the effects of mutual gaze. The study I'm going to present to you, families were randomized into one of 3 groups. The Pathways group, the Communication group, and the Communication group were the project-related experimental conditions, and the Service as Usual group was the control. The children in the service as usual group were enrolled in ECI programs. Some of them also supplemented their ECI programs with other therapies, and they received an average of 7.6 hours of therapy a week. This is in contrast to the Pathways and Communication group, who received only 1.5 hours a week of parent coaching. We compared the Pathways and the Services as Usual group to answer our first question: is Pathways an effective ECI model? And we compared pathways and the communication group to answer the question, is mutual gaze an important ingredient for the intervention's success? Now, to understand the difference between the pathways and the communication group, you need to understand that the units are cumulative. Each unit builds on the preceding unit to slowly move the parent towards increasingly more sophisticated levels of interaction with their toddler. Once an intervention strategy is introduced, the parent's expected to use that strategy in subsequent interactions. Now, I know this is a very difficult slide. There's way too much information on it, but it's meant to show you that the units in the pathways and communication intervention were exactly the same, except for Unit 3, where pathways looked at facilitating mutual gaze and communication group worked on facilitating communication. Everything else in all units were the same. The demographics of the children and the cognitive level of the toddlers were roughly equivalent to statewide ECI demographics, and there are no statistical differences on these and other background variables such as mother's education and autism severity. We collected several pre and post intervention variables, including a 10-minute parent-child interaction. So here I'm going to give you a little snippet of a pre-intervention video from one of our Spanish-speaking participants. The mother is speaking Spanish, but you really don't need to understand Spanish to understand the video. The child's 29 months of age and was receiving speech therapy through an ECI program for 11 months prior to the study.
Sopla, sopla. Muy bien. Dale más. Aquí, más. Mira, ¿cómo hace? ¿Cómo hace?
The videos were coded and checked for reliability. And the data that I'm going to show you today is a change from pre-intervention to post-intervention on the sharing emotion skills of initiating social eye gaze, which is mutual gaze, but the child had to initiate the interaction, verbal vocal reciprocity, so that's social reciprocity, and also for intentional communication. In addition, I'm going to show you data from the Vineland 2 social subscale, which is a standardized parent interview that's available in both English and Spanish. The way that I'm going to show you change is with residual change score. So what you need to know is that the orange line is at 0. That would mean no change from pre to post intervention. Anything below the line, the children regressed from pre to post intervention, and anything above was an increase. So here we have our measures for social eye gaze and the Vineland social subscale. We found that Pathways group made significantly more change in social eye gaze and on the Vineland subscale compared to the other two groups that were equal. The effect for both of these was large for the social eye gaze, and it was a moderate effect for the Vineland social. There was there was not a significant difference between the Pathways group and the communication group on verbal vocal reciprocity, and they both did much better than the services as usual group. And in terms of intentional communication, there was no significant difference between any of the groups. This is a particular interesting because Pathways group did not work on communication, and the communication group worked on directly on communication. So this was an interesting finding. So I want you to remember the little girl you saw playing on the floor. And if a picture's worth 1,000 words, a video is worth way more. So this is her after only 12 weeks of Pathways intervention.
Mu, mu. Juguemos al pollito. Pío, pío, pío. Juguemos al patico. quack, quack, quack. Yay! Choo-choo! Choo-choo!
So I could watch that video all day. So our key findings were that toddlers with autism had maximal benefit when parents were coached on the shared emotion skills. Pathways protocol for mutual gaze appears to be the key ingredient for social development, and facilitating mutual gaze appeared to have a cascading effect on communication. And last, pathways seems to be an effective early intervention model. We also wanted to look at parent stress because parent-mediated interventions work with parents on the parent-child interaction, and we know parenting stress affects parent behaviors and positive parenting behavior. This relationship was particularly interesting to us because parents of children with ASD tend to have higher levels of stress compared to parents of typically developing children, and also compared to parents of children with all other developmental disorders. And parents of children with autism around the time of diagnosis, which this was for our parents, seem to be the most stressed of the parents of autistic children. So we used the Parenting Stress Index, and we found that parents in the pathways and the communication group both decreased stress on average from pre to post intervention, where the parents in the services as usual group increased stress, parenting stress, and this was a moderate effect. We also looked at the relationship between initial parenting stress and change in positive parenting behaviors measured by parent responsivity. So parent responsivity was a positive parenting behavior we were looking at. Again, on this graph, 0 indicates no change from pre to post intervention, and above the 0 line is improvement, below is regression. We found a significant group by stress interaction, indicating that on average, initial stress at pre-intervention did not predict positive parenting behaviors in the pathways group. On the other hand, there was a steep negative effect of parenting stress on positive parenting behaviors in the service as usual group. So we found that very interesting. And so my time's about up. So where are we going to go from here? Our directions. So we've been evaluating these two things to evaluate the effectiveness of pathways in children from 3 to 5 years of age because of brain plasticity. We are investigating whether or not the effects of pathways decreases with age. So far, we're finding very similar effects with our 3 to 4-year-old group, and these effects are sustained 3 months later. We're hoping to collect more data on 4 to 5-year-old children when we can get back into in-person research. The other thing that we have started to look at is evaluating the effectiveness of pathways in Part C ECI program, so under real world condition. Our research is all in research condition where the clinicians had very few clients, and we know that ECI providers have lots of clients, 30 and above sometimes. So can an early interventionist provide pathways with fidelity in their busy day? This is really important because our research thus far has impacted early intervention across the state of Texas. 20 ECI programs across the state and representing the purple regions on this graph are currently using the program. However, we don't know its effectiveness under real world conditions. We have partnered with the Warren Center in Dallas to answer this question. And we got funded right as the pandemic started. So we moved over to telehealth, and we are collecting that data now, but we're looking forward to getting back to in-person research so we can answer the question more directly. With that, I just want to acknowledge the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board and the Texas State Legislation for funding our research, the students and assistants in the Social Communication Lab, Renee Hoffman and Michelle Campbell of the Pathways Early Intervention, the parents and the families, and of course our wonderful interventionists. Thank you. Dr. Owens mentioned that we're going to wait to the end of Dr. Warner's CIS presentation to take questions. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Warner Sis, who will talk to you about the work with children with hearing differences and their families.
Thank you so much, Pam. That was a fabulous talk. I always love hearing about your work. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So you should be able to see my slides now. And thank you, as Pam said, we're so excited to be able to share our work with you today. And I can't wait to tell you more about what we're doing in the CHILL Lab, the Children and Infant Listening Lab at UT Dallas. I'd like to continue where Pam left off, talking about relational health in children who have special needs. And I'm going to focus my talk on children who are deaf or hard of hearing. Our goals for today are to understand the effects of hearing loss on the child themselves and on the family unit, and how to address this concept conceptually and clinically. Before we do that, what I really want to do is talk a little bit about hearing differences in children. We think about sensory neural hearing loss, which occurs frequently. Sensory neural hearing loss is something where the etiology is affecting from the inner ear or beyond, and affects between 2 and 4 out of every 1,000 newborn infants. If we combine that with the children who are a little bit older and acquire hearing loss, that means that we're identifying over 15,000 infants and toddlers annually as deaf or hard of hearing in the United States. So this is a very commonly occurring health issue in early childhood. Let's talk a little bit about how having hearing difference affects audibility. So here on the left, you'll see what we call an audiogram. And on the x-axis, we have frequency or pitch, going from low frequencies on the left side to high frequencies or high pitches on the right side. And on the y-axis, we have intensity or loudness, going from very quiet sounds at the top to very loud sounds at the bottom. In this area right here, it's this kind of purple shaded area. You'll see all these different sounds of American English. And what that represents is those are the speech sounds that a child will need access to in order to develop spoken language. If we relate that to how we typically graph a hearing loss or hearing sensitivity, this is an example of what typical hearing sensitivity looks like. So these blue X's at the top are showing the lowest, the quietest sounds that somebody can hear. And you can see that they can have access to all of the different sounds, including all of these dots. And if you look, those dots are actually representing those different sounds of speech. So having access to all of the dots means that they have access to 100% of speech sounds, that those are all the ones that are available to the listener. Look at the difference in audibility with the presence of a hearing difference shown on the right. So this is a moderate hearing loss. And if we count the dots beneath those X's, we can see that unmanaged hearing loss of this level could result in inaccessibility of up to 75% of the speech sounds. And for a child who has severe to profound hearing loss, shown in the lighter blue, without any auditory technology, they will have zero access to those speech sounds. What we know is that auditory technology, such as hearing aids or cochlear implants, can provide access to the sounds of speech, shifting audibility from below 25% to above 80%. Gaining audibility, we're back. Gaining audibility improves the odds that a child who's deaf or hard of hearing will develop speech and language skills, which has cascading effects on their social abilities, academic performance, and employment opportunities. Much research in the past has focused on factors that influence outcomes in children who are deaf or hard of hearing. This has really focused on this incredible variability that we see in their outcomes. And most of the research has focused on demographic characteristics, such as how old they are or nonverbal IQ, audiologic factors, medical history, type of therapy, educational setting. And researchers are primarily focusing on these factors that we can observe in clinic. But we really need to remember that children spend most of their time outside of the clinic at home with their family. And that's where I want to focus. So maybe we need to think a little bit more about that family system and the relational health that goes along with that. If we think about this in terms of relational health, we can connect it with family systems theory. And what family systems theory posits is that family members function in relation to one another as a dynamic system. So change in one family member can lead to change in the others. For instance, we have a child, and this child has a family made up of parents and siblings. Not only does this child impact the state of the parents and the siblings, but those other family members also impact the child. And each family member interacts with each other. So for instance, let's say that the child receives the diagnosis of a hearing loss and ends up receiving a cochlear implant. This affects the functioning of the child themselves directly, but also indirectly affects those family members. Let me give you an example of what I mean by focusing on the parent-child interaction. Hearing differences in a child can elicit both positive and negative effects. For example, parents may feel a stronger bond with their child and have more sensitivity to other people's differences. This in turn may enhance positive interactions and improve the child's adjustment. But on the flip side, families may worry about the child's future and the time and monetary demands that go along with the intervention for a child who is deaf or hard of hearing. These stressors may create negative emotions that compromise family interactions and the child's adjustment. For right now, I'd like to focus on parental stress, which tends to increase in families who have children who have special needs. And this is something that Pam just talked about as far as the parenting stress affecting those positive parenting behaviors. Interestingly, research has shown little to no significant effect of auditory status on overall parenting stress. However, we still have families that are in the high risk range for those stress levels, either having high stress or that they're clinically stressed. This figure shows the percentage of parents with high stress. I'm trying to get my mouse over here. So on the y-axis, we have the percentage of parents with high or clinically stressed levels. And on the x-axis, we have different aspects of the parenting stress index, which is one of the same measures that Pam just talked about. The PSI has 3 subdomains: parental distress, parent-child interaction, and difficult child, and then 1 total stress category, which is a compilation of the 3 subdomains. What we can see here is that parents of children who are deaf or hard of hearing, about 15 to 20% of them have high or clinical levels of stress. But what I really want to point out here is that even though we have that, there is no significant difference. It looks exactly the same as what the stress levels that we see in parents of children with typical development. So to put this in context though, let's go back to what Pam was talking about with the parents of children who have autism. And you can see that those are the ones shown in black. And for the children with autism, their parents feel very stressed. And this is before they had her amazing intervention. And about 30% of them are showing clinical levels of stress. And it's mainly related to that parent-child interaction domain. What we took away from this, as far as thinking about the PSI with children who are deaf or hard of hearing, is that it might not be capturing the stressors that are actually affecting parents of children who are deaf or hard of hearing. And that's what we sought to address. So my colleagues and I wanted to update our knowledge of parental stress and examine parents of school-age children to see what, if anything, had changed over the past decade. So we asked, what is the level of their stress? How does it differ from previous samples of children who are deaf or hard of hearing? And which factors were affecting their stress levels? We had 31 parents who answered this questionnaire. You can see here that these are children who were identified early with their hearing loss. They got their cochlear implants early and they're long-term users. So these are kids who are a little bit older, but a lot of this is stemming from things that happened in their early childhood. Rather than using a generic stress measure, we use something called the Family Stress Scale. And this is a measure that includes items that are specific to parenting a child who is deaf or hard of hearing. The scale includes general stress items, things like finances and child safety, but it also includes hearing loss specific stressors, such as maintaining the device and serving as a language model for their child. First, we compared our sample to 2 other samples that use the same exact measure. We saw a significant difference across device generation, so less stress in parents of current users, shown on the far right, compared to older generation users from the early 90s, shown in the middle. And I should have oriented you to the graph, so the parent stress is on the y-axis, and a higher score means that the parent felt more stressed. So the parents of the older generation cochlear implant users felt more stressed than those in our current sample. Comparing the cochlear implants candidates before implantation to our sample of current cochlear implant users, we found no significant difference, which completely blew our mind, to be honest. If I said we expected that, I would be completely lying. So we weren't expecting that at all. But when we looked at the items specifically, we found that the things that were making these parents stressed was completely different. So our current sample of contemporary cochlear implant users had less stress about safety, device retention, and communication. I want to delve into that just a tiny bit more. So with safety, for the pre-implant, I think the parents were really concerned their children didn't have the communication skills, they didn't know what to expect, and they weren't hearing, so the parents were very concerned about their child's safety. Relative to keeping the device on, this is something that we see a lot in younger children, that they just want to take the device off. They don't understand that it's useful, and so the parents are constantly getting the device back on until the child gets used to that. For the children in our sample who were long-term cochlear implant users, they all had been wearing the device for so long, they had the communication skills, and they kept it on. Now, that's not always the case. Just to put a caveat on that, that sometimes what we see in children in middle school and high school is that they tend to take the device off more for stigma reasons, but that is not necessarily the case in our sample. But I did want to put that out there, that I know that that does exist and that happens in the real world. And finally, communication. Early on, pre-implant, parents have a lot of stress relative to what is their child's trajectory going to look like? Are they going to develop speech and language? Will they be able to hear? And will they be able to connect with others? For our particular sample, these are children who are older, they've had the device for a while, and they have developed those speech and language skills. So the stress level of the parents has decreased relative to these 3 areas. I know that you want to know what parents in the current group of cochlear implant users were stressed about, and mainly discipline, which anyone who has middle schoolers or high schoolers, yes, discipline, definitely an issue. finances, educational concerns, and also marital relationships. We also found variables that were related to parent stress. So again, here we have parental stress on the y-axis with higher levels, meaning more stress. And on the x-axis, we have speech intelligibility, so a type of communication skill on the left, and we have effortful control or self-regulation on the right. For both intelligibility and effortful control, scores on the right are showing better intelligibility and better self-regulation. What we see is a negative correlation with both of these factors, such that better intelligibility and better self-regulation are associated with lower levels of parent stress. When we put both of these into the model, the only factor that came out as significant is that effortful control. So a child's ability to self-regulate was most closely related to parental stress, even when we put in all of the child and cochlear implant related factors. The stressors identified in our study, child communication and temperament, align with stressors for parents regardless of auditory status. The stress affects the parent, but also the parent's interactions and those positive parenting behaviors that Dr. Rollins talked about earlier. You can see that parent stress can affect the parenting styles, maternal sensitivity, and also their marital interrelationships. In addition to these typical stressors, parents of children with exceptionalities have unique stressors. This may result from the greater demands that are put on them, the increased resources that they need to support a child with special needs, and possibly unrealized expectations for their child. If we think specifically about children who are deaf or hard of hearing, this also may relate to their ability to manage the auditory technology to make sure that those hearing aids and cochlear implants are continually working, taking their children to the audiology and speech language pathology therapy appointments, and also serving as a language model for their child, that can be stressful as well. So the first study I talked about focused on that parent-child relationship, but we also can consider other members of the family. The next study I want to talk about has to do with typical hearing siblings who have a brother or sister with a cochlear implant. And our goal was to understand the siblings' perspective of having a brother or sister who has hearing loss. Participants included 36 children with typical hearing between the ages of 6 and 17, whose brother or sister had at least one cochlear implant. You can see the two groups were relatively similar in age, and they were equally distributed relative to gender and birth order. And what we did was we asked them, we used a mixed methods approach, and we asked them about their perspectives of their sibling who had a cochlear implant. And we also asked about the effect of hearing loss on them. The second part had to do with the qualitative, and there were these open-ended questions where we just asked them about their experience of having a brother or sister who had a hearing loss. Looking at the quantitative data, we're going to focus first on the top bar that says sibling perspectives of the cochlear implant user. A higher score in this case is more positive. And looking at the quantitative data, we found that siblings have a general positive perception of the cochlear implant user. They rated items very highly relative to their cochlear implant users' esteem, their enjoyment of school, self-worth, and their knowledge of the cochlear implant and the hearing loss. In contrast, if we focus on the second bar that says effective hearing loss on the sibling, for this, a higher score is a more negative perception. And you can see that they're also showing very positive results here, meaning that they don't really feel affected by the hearing loss. In fact, they said that they didn't feel any resentment toward the cochlear implant user or to the parents. And finally, if we look at the blue text on the bottom, we find that siblings were more in tune with their the cochlear implant user's communication skills. And what I mean by that is that if the sibling with typical hearing rated the communication skills of their brother or sister more positively, they were more likely to have positive aspects, positive perspectives of their sibling, and feel less effects of the hearing loss on themselves. What's interesting is that the qualitative data both supported and refuted what we found in the quantitative data. Most siblings' comments about the cochlear implant user were positive. For example, instead of feeling farther apart from my brother, I feel closer to him. Comments about the impact of hearing loss on the siblings were more negative than what we thought was going to happen based on the quantitative data. For example, sometimes I want to hang out with my parents, but if something happens to my brother's cochlear implants, they might not have the time to spend with me. This was not an isolated incident, and that resentment toward the parents for unequal attention came out from several different of the participants. And finally, communication and how the siblings viewed communication tended to be more negative. For instance, it makes me upset when she's not acting normal with her friends, and it's hard for me to realize how much hearing loss really affects her. These data suggest that while many siblings of children who have cochlear implants have positive relationships, they love their sibling, and a lot of them told us that they thought their sibling was awesome. I think they're awesome too. And they definitely said that they have no resentment toward their brother or sister who has a cochlear implant. But some of them still struggle with particular aspects of having a child with hearing loss in their family, particularly when the child has poor communication skills. And the most common theme to emerge centered on unequal attention from parents. Thinking back to the family system, we have an interactive family dynamic. I've described 2 studies involving children who are deaf or hard of hearing who use cochlear implants. One focused on the parent-child connection and one centered on the sibling perspective. The viewpoints of their sibling relative to their own relationship with the parents elucidated the need for future research to consider the family's interrelationships as a unit to fully capture the effect of having a child with hearing loss in the family. How might this work in the clinic? It could relate to interventions that focus on the whole family, including stress reduction in parents. In addition to referrals for counseling, we can borrow from cognitive behavioral therapy and help parents focus on things like cognitive reframing. So this might take looking at a situation negatively and converting that to a more positive view. A second way that we can address this clinically is through sibling engagement. Research of families with hearing loss supports the benefit of sibling support groups and camps that allow these siblings to share common feelings and their needs. In addition, it might be worth it to think about those siblings who don't have a special need, and make sure that they are getting dedicated time from their parents, or at least suggest that to the parents. And finally, focusing on the family as a whole. Encourage patients and their families to engage in support groups and family camps. This includes grandparents, aunties, and uncles in the rehabilitation process, which might mean helping them to understand what the hearing loss, how it affects audibility, how using a hearing aid or cochlear implant can improve that, learning sign language, and learning how to communicate efficiently and effectively as a unit. In conclusion, pediatric hearing differences have both direct and indirect effects on the family members, and these may emerge very early in childhood and have residual effects that will come to fruition in middle childhood and late childhood and onto adulthood as well. What I suggest is that clinicians can incorporate ways to encourage and engage the entire family, which will enhance well-being, not just in the individual who has hearing loss, but also in the rest of the family members. These connections are incredibly vital in early childhood when children who are deaf or hard of hearing learn to communicate with others, interact socially, and their primary support group, their family. So thank you so much for listening. I'd like to acknowledge the funding sources that have supported this work over the past few years, including the Carpenter Foundation, Faculty Research Initiative, and also a donation from Mohammed and Beth Ennis, recruitment through different resources, students in the lab who've helped collect data, and of course the participants and their family. So thank you so much for listening. I will stop sharing my screen. And we're happy to entertain questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Pam. And if you would, yes, turn on your camera too. So the three of us are now being seen by the rest of you guys. And there are several questions. Some questions for clarification about the research, some questions very much about applications to practice. So and please continue to send your questions and we'll see what we can get to here in about, 5-7 minutes. There were, I don't know if I published it, but probably I did. There were some questions and issues related to actual diagnosis and the period of stress in the family prior to really getting a diagnosis of a hearing loss or a hearing difference, or certainly of autism. And so that kind of question goes to both of you and your experience of the family's experiences in that nebulous time before diagnoses are confirmed.
Pam, do you want to go first?
Yeah, that's a real hard one on so many levels.
Sorry to start hard.
No, it's okay. And I think there was a question about how often do parents notice the decrease in mutual gaze? And I think that's related. So I'm going to start there if that's okay. So when a lot of parents are not familiar or as much, and a lot of physicians, pediatricians are not familiar with early social development in children in the first 2 years of life. And what parents are paying attention to is a child talking? Does he have a word? Does he have 2 words? Not how is he using those words to communicate. And so, as I said, autism is not a language impairment, and many children with autism do use words. And so people are focusing on those kinds of things. Are they walking? Are they crawling? Those kinds of things. And so they're not really focused on the social communication. And so a lot of parents, because the children may be using words, are in denial. They don't want to use the A word. And they might have a gut feeling that something is going on, but they don't really want to acknowledge it. And so one of the things that, and it's very stressful because the child's not interacting with them and they tend to say, oh, he's so independent. And the answer is he's 2, he's not supposed to be independent, right? And so it's very stressful because they don't understand what's going on, but they have a gut feeling that something's going on. And autism is such a big word, right? But the only thing we really know about autism is early intervention is the only thing that ameliorates the effects. And so it's a hard, as a professional, it's hard because we try to get them early. So what I do really is I go to physicians, I go to parent groups, I am, anybody who will have me. And I have a talk that I give, it's called Words Are Not Enough. And anybody who wants me to give it, I'll give this talk because I think it's so important to educate people on early social communication and what that looks like so that they can recognize when things are going off the rails. So yes, it's very stressful.
I'll follow up with just one more question to that. So what questions do you urge pediatricians to be asking in addition to, are they understanding your words? Do they have any words? Do you ask about, are you enjoying each other?
Yeah, I think that if a pediatrician can do a short observation, which is really difficult, and often the children don't interact the same when they're in the office. Usually right now, people start with the whole joint attention issue. Are they pointing and are they pointing to something? Because when you point to someone, to something, to show someone something, you're saying, I know you can be looking anywhere you want to be looking, but I want you to be looking where I'm looking. So I'm going to point to something. And that is huge. That's something that kids on the spectrum have extraordinary problems with. It's supposed to happen robustly around 15 months of age. And so if pediatricians could just do that, we would be in a much better position.
And Andrea, someone commented on, how great it was to hear the stats on how common deafness or hard of hearing is. And, going between wondering, is there a problem, to having that diagnosed. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. And it used to be when we just relied on parents to determine if something was going on with their child. It would take about 8 to 16 months between when the parents first suspected something was going on to when they actually got diagnosed. So with newborn hearing screening, we have 98% of babies who are getting screened. So we have an idea early on if these babies have something going on. I think the hardest thing is when the baby does not pass that newborn hearing screening, the stress that goes along with that. Is it because the baby was bathed in amniotic fluid, which can happen, but the most important thing is to get them back in and check them diagnostically. So striking that balance between stressing the parents out enough that they come back to find out, is it real or not, but not stressing them out too much that they can't face it, which I think is kind of what Pam was saying with the A word is a really big word. And so making sure that that parents are aware, because we want to, again, just like with autism, early diagnosis and early intervention is key. So we want to have all of those babies diagnosed by 3 months at the absolute latest. Joint Commission on Infant Hearing is actually pushing toward 2 months right now.
Okay, thanks. But we're getting lots of questions. So let me, and I haven't published all of these, but let me ask maybe something a little different. One participant said, I noticed that the adults working with the autistic children were wearing funky glasses. Can you say anything about that?
Thank you. Yeah, I didn't mention that. So the funky glasses, those are the parents, right? And we wanted to look at whether or not the child was looking up at the parent's face and smiling, right? So in order to capture that on videotape, we gave them funky glasses and it had a video camera in the middle so that we could look at that. And then we had 2 videos, the wide angle video, and then we coordinated them in the lab so that anytime the child looked up, we could look at the video through the glasses to see whether or not the child was looking up and smiling at the mom's face.
Great. And another question about the research, and this for you, Andrea. In looking at parent stress, were all of the parents, did they all have typical hearing in the sample that you studied? And what about that issue?
That is a great question. In our sample, all of the parents did have typical hearing. 90% of children who are deaf or hard of hearing actually have 2 hearing parents. And so that's especially the ones who get cochlear implants. We tend to have considerably more parents who have typical hearing. I think it would be a little bit different if the parents had some degree of hearing loss, or if they were deaf. If they were deaf, they may or may not opt for a cochlear implant. So that's a completely different topic. And I'm happy to talk about that online if you want to contact me.
Okay. And though we're out of time, a very quick question, Pam. Is Pathways in Florida?
No, not that I know of, but you can contact me and we can talk to you about that.
Okay. And then there are also questions about the training of students that is going on at the Callier Center for Communication Disorders to work on these issues, and how audiologists may or may not be dealing with family stress, family interactions, all of this. Maybe we have another whole topic here, lots of topics. But we're out of time. So I think I will thank you. We have no applause, but I thank you. And I do want to mention to everyone who is participating in today's webinar, I want to give a little plug for the next webinar coming up in May, the next webinar of the University of Texas System Early Childhood Scholar Series. It will be hosted by Dr. Richard Adams. He is Chief of the Division of Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics at UT Southwestern Medical Center here in Dallas. And you'll be hearing then from Drs. Abigail Kissel and Sari Barr from the division, and they'll be focusing on medical and community connections in the training of pediatricians in ways that are strengthening the early childhood landscape. And so I hope you all come back Thursday, May 20th. Be sure to register so you can join our series. This will be the last of I guess this academic fiscal year, and after that we'll resume next September. So come back in May. And thank you all for being here.